Hello, my beautiful friends. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Cami, and what I like to do here on YouTube is I like to discuss true crime and pyramid schemes and anything and everything in between. Okay, so the case that we're talking about today came into my knowledge in around 2012. Y'all know how much I love my Lifetime movies, as trashy as they are, but that's kind of how I became aware of this case, was because of a Lifetime movie. And if you are familiar with the case, you know exactly what movie I'm talking about. Today we are talking about the case of Susan Wright, also known as the Blue-Eyed Butcher. So sit back, grab a drink, grab a snack, grab whatever you want, and let's jump right into it. So Susan Wright was born on April 24th, 1976, to a woman named Sue Wella and a man named Jimmy Lawrence Wright. Wyke? I don't know how to say that name. And there's not a whole lot known about Susan's past, but the only thing that we really know is that at age 17, she started working as a topless dancer at a place called Gold Cup, and she worked there for about 2 months. So in 1997 in Galveston, Texas, Susan was actually working as a waitress, which is where she met her future husband named Jeffrey Wright. And she met him on a double date, and he was 8 years her senior, so she was 21, he was 29. It wasn't long after they started dating that Susan actually got pregnant with their first son, a child that they would go on to name Bradley. And in 1998, Susan and Jeff got married, and shortly after, she gave birth to their son. And a few years after the birth of their son Bradley, she would give birth to another child, a daughter named Kaylee. Everything seemed completely normal in their relationship, but as we all know, everything is not as it seems. We wouldn't be here if everything was as it seemed. Jeffrey Wright was characterized by many as a man that just loved to have fun and someone that was charming and had no problems meeting women. And the activities that he liked to indulge himself in were things like doing drugs and going to topless bars, which there's nothing wrong with that. I want to make that clear. There's nothing wrong with indulging in a recreational drug every now and then, as long as it's not something that is going to kill you. And there's nothing wrong with going to topless clubs. So I just want to make that clear. But as we find out later in the case, it was more than just occasionally indulging in like a marijuana joint or like occasionally dropping a hit of acid. No, it was a lot more than that, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. Friends of Jeffrey said that marriage seemed to look really good on Jeffrey, and that he appeared to be a proud father who enjoyed the stability of family life. So Susan actually was a stay-at-home mom, so she would care for the couple's 2 children, Bradley and Kaylee, while Jeffrey worked as a sales representative for carpet and tile companies. Things were not as happy as they appeared to be to outsiders. So according to Susan, Jeff would become controlling around the time that Bradley was born, and he required her to notify him of her whereabouts at all times. He only permitted her to leave the house for short periods of time, and any time she would go to the store and not tell him, or she would spend a few extra minutes at her parents' house, he would accuse her of cheating on him. Susan claims that she was expected to keep a perfect home and that even a toy on the floor or dinner on the table a few minutes late would send Jeffrey into a fit of rage. Susan maintains that she was verbally abused, physically battered, and often raped by her husband. Susan claims that Jeff would frequently use illegal substances throughout the years that they were married, and that he would often become violent while under the influence of those drugs. So on January 13th in 2003, when Jeff came home after a cocaine binge, he was in a rage, and that was when Susan decided that she was going to end things once and for all. According to court documents, Susan claimed that Jeff focused his anger exclusively on the children that night, hitting Bradley, who was then 4, in the face, and then after he would slap Bradley around, he would then and threaten to kill Susan. Susan claims that after this, she managed to find a knife and stab Jeff, but that once she started, she couldn't stop. She said, quote, "I couldn't stop stabbing him. I couldn't. I knew as soon as I stopped, he was going to get the knife back and he was going to kill me. I didn't want to die." Susan also claims that after she killed Jeff, she was just in a fog for the rest of the week. Now, prosecutors took this and spun a completely different story. According to prosecutors, Susan seduced Jeff by tying his wrists and ankles to the bed in a gesture of romance, only to grab the knife and start stabbing him. Jeff ended up with 193 stab wounds from 2 different knives, 41 to his face, 46 to his chest, and 7 in his groin area, plus other stabs. Susan had thrust one of the knives so hard into Jeff that the tip actually broke off into his skull. After Susan was done stabbing Jeff, that was when she decided that she was going to hide his body. According to Susan, she sat up all night after the stabbing happened, scared that he was going to rise from the dead and attack her again. Later on, she ties him to this dolly, like one of the rolly thingies that you use to move furniture. And she brought him into the backyard where she buried him beneath this potting soil, beneath this hole. Well, she put him into the hole and she buried him with potting soil. And this hole was from a fountain that he was supposed to install but never got around to. And occasionally she would put more potting soil on it to weigh him down because she was still fearful of him. She did not eat and got no sleep, instead sitting awake on the couch at night, clutching the knife, expecting a furious Jeff to arrive home at any moment, she said. She then tried to clean their bedroom with bleach and even tried painting the walls, but said that there was blood splattered everywhere and that she couldn't get rid of it. She also went to the police station the next day to report a domestic abuse incident and obtained a restraining order against Jeff in order to explain his disappearance. Several days later, she catches the family dog digging up Jeff's body, and that's when she knew that she could not keep her secret for much longer. So on January 18th of 2003, she calls her attorney Neil Davis and confessed to everything. 5 days after the killing, Susan told her mother what had happened. After the family contacted the Houston law firm DeGuerin, Dixon, and Hennessy, lawyer Neil Davis had Susan admitted to a mental health facility. On the evening of January 18, 2003, Neil went to the district attorney's office to report a dead body to the prosecutors. He gave them the address, but he refused to tell them who his client was or how he was made aware of the corpse. That night, the authorities went to the home and found the partially buried body of Jeffrey Wright. And he was partially buried because the family dog had apparently unearthed him and chewed off his left hand. It's not funny. I don't mean to laugh. Neckties were found around Jeffrey's wrists, and one ankle was bound by a bathrobe stash. Bathrobe sash. Bathroom stash of marijuana. There was red candle wax, LAX. We're going to the airport, y'all. There was red candle wax on Jeffrey's buttock, thigh, and genital area, apparently from candles found in the bedroom. A knife, which was described as a small hunting knife with a broken tip, was found in a flower pot on the patio. So she pleads not guilty by reason of self-defense, but at her trial in February of 2004, prosecutors decided that they were going to use Susan's past as a topless dancer to paint her as this horrible, money-hungry wife that just wanted Jeff's $200,000 life insurance policy. Meanwhile, the defense attorney, Neil Davis, portrayed Susan as a woman who had suffered years of abuse by her husband and only killed him to protect herself and her children. Susan testified in her own defense with a very emotional response, explaining how on the night of the murder, her husband was on a cocaine binge and had allegedly beaten her. And others testified on Susan's behalf, including her mother. Kelly Siegler, who was one of the prosecuting attorneys, even brought in the bed that Jeb. Oh my God, I can't talk today. That Jeff was stabbed in to present as evidence.
Prosecutors reenacted how they say Susan stabbed her husband Jeffrey nearly 200 times.
So they bring in this bed to attempt to recreate their theory of the crime for the jury. They even brought the mattress in as well, and they assembled it all into court, and This was assembled during a recess. Susan broke down at the side of the bed and continued to cry throughout the demonstration. With the jury present, this woman, Kelly Siegler, established that she herself was the approximate size of Susan Wright, and that a male colleague of hers, Paul Doyle, is the height and weight of Jeffrey. Kelly Siegler then asked the witness, lead investigator Mark Reynolds, to tie her colleague to the bed with neckties and bathrobe sashes in the manner indicated by the ligatures found on Jeffrey's wrists and leg. And after Reynolds did so, Siegler climbed onto the bed and straddled her colleague, knife in hand, and began a laborious demonstration of how the wounds to Jeff's body were likely inflicted. However, the judge that was presiding over this case, Judge Jim Wallace, sustained an ejection by the defense when Siegler attempted to act out Susan's own scenario by lying on the bed with Doyle on top of her to show that Wright couldn't have wrestled free of her husband in that situation. Defense attorneys said that the courtroom theatrics that Kelly Siegler was putting on should be confined to bad TV movies, which is ironic since this got made into a bad TV movie. Siegler maintained that the dramatic demonstration was the only way to drive home to jurors exactly how defenseless Jeff was, regardless of whether he was a perfect husband. Because the neckties and the bathrobe sash was found on Jeffrey Wright's arm and leg appeared to have been cut, Siegler argued that it was clear that he was tied up at the time of the stabbing, and she argued that the candle wax that was found on his body was used as some part of some sex game that had gone wrong, which ended up in Susan stabbing her husband 193 times. The number of stab wounds took too much time and effort to inflict, which the prosecution claimed showed the defendant's calculating state of mind. Furthermore, wounds on the victim's genitals were superficial nicks and slashes, which Siegler said Susan Wright inflicted coolly and deliberately. So Kelly Siegler was just not having the defense's claim that Susan had a break with reality after the killing. The bleach and paint, she claimed, were merely purchased to cover up a crime, not because of a fear of her dead husband would be angered by a mess, which is what Susan was claiming. Siegler claimed that in these moments of fog, that Susan was somehow lucid enough to take her husband's name off of the answering machine message and cleaned out their joint checking account. According to prosecutors, Susan began to manipulate the people around her with lies to cover up what she had done by playing the role of abused, frightened wife. Susan's defense attorney said that Susan was in constant fear of everything, from the kids acting up to dinner being late. Anything short of perfection was unacceptable and would result in violent tantrums by Jeff. So, the prosecutors had their own set of witnesses that portrayed Jeffrey Wright as this loving, non-violent husband. So, to counteract this, the defense team had their own witnesses who portrayed him as someone who often abused his dogs. Jeffrey Wright, the defense painted out, was even convicted of assaulting a stripper with whom he was having an affair. Defense attorneys even received a call from one of Jeff's party buddies before trial who agreed to testify to the Jeff he knew, a man who often lost all control of his who often lost control of his temper and flew into violent rages, many of them drug-fueled. Those close to Susan Wright said they long suspected she was being physically abused by her husband, and her sister claimed to have been aware of it, and a neighbor says she knew about the fear Susan had of Jeff. Even Susan's hairdresser said she observed odd bruises and assumed they were the result of domestic violence. The defense also maintained that police ignored key evidence in the home, including holes in the wall that had been sloppily patched from incidents in which Jeff had allegedly threw punches at his wife and missed. Also ignored, the defense attorney said, was a shattered bathroom door frame that was broken when Jeff apparently slammed the door on his wife's arm repeatedly until the wood cracked. The constant abuse, the defense attorney argued, had obviously had an effect on Susan's mental and emotional state for a very long time, and on the night of the killing, they said that she was pushed over the edge and experienced a complete break of reality. Susan's irrational behavior during her week of fog is evidence of this, which is what her attorney said. She did a horrendously poor job of cleaning up the scene, hardly acting the part of a cold-blooded, methodical murderess. Wright showed signs of a complete detach from reality, even when the lawyers met her almost a week after the stabbing, and was still terrified of her dead husband. The defense also maintained physical evidence proves that Susan Wright's account of the stabbing is true. Jeff had clear defensive wounds on his hand, and one doesn't get defensive wounds unless someone is free to fight. So they were arguing that he wasn't tied up at all. There were no bruises on Jeffrey Wright's wrists and ankles. There would have been if he had been secured tightly and struggling. According to the defense, police also fumbled some key pieces of evidence, because of course they did. The bed frame, for example, was never checked for fibers from the neckties and bathrobe sashes that were allegedly tied to it. The fingernail clippings from Jeff Wright's hand, which surely would have shown that he had scratched Susan during a struggle that night, were not properly preserved and became moldy and unusable as they sat in the evidence room. As for the life insurance policy, her attorney argued that with so much... As for the life insurance policy, Neil Davis said that, as with so much else in Jeffrey Wright's life, this too was kept from Susan. In fact, not only did she not know about the policy on him, but she was concerned because he'd wanted to take one out on her. The defense attorney argued that even if the jury did find Susan guilty of murder, that Susan was still a loving mother of 2 small children with no history of crime or violence and should only receive probation. However, in the end, the jury believed the claim that Susan was faking her testimony and found her guilty of murder, sentencing her to 25 years in prison. In 2008, Susan appealed the decision and even had Jeff's ex-fiancée, Misty McMichael, on her side. Misty testified that Jeff was abusive to her throughout their entire relationship, once throwing her down a flight of stairs. He was also charged with assault after he had cut her with this broken bottle glass, but she had dropped the charges because she was scared of him. Because of this new information presented, Susan's sentence was reduced to 20 years in prison, and as of December of 2020, she was released on parole after serving 16 years in prison. After her release, cameras followed her to her car, and she was begging them, quote, "Please don't do this to my family. I would just like a little privacy. Please respect that." One of Susan's attorneys, Brian Weiss, told Texas Monthly after her appellate hearing, quote, "Just about everyone in Houston believes Susan Wright was a monster. Everyone believed that she was some real-life incarnation of Sharon Stone from the first reel of Basic Instinct. There was just one problem. Everyone had gotten it wrong." And that is the case of Susan Wright. I almost said Susan Smith, but that's another true crime case. So what did y'all think of this one? What's your opinion on whether Susan was telling the truth or whether she wasn't telling the truth? Personally, with all the evidence presented and with the fact that police fumbled this so hard, I believe Susan. I don't think that she was just some money-hungry gold digger who was after Jeff's life insurance policy. I mean, if you look at the fact that someone else has a history of violence with him, I think that speaks pretty clearly for itself. But as always, I want to know what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you all in my next one. Bye!